I was on holiday in France, biking around the countryside. I had just pushed my bike up a mountain and I was sitting on the grass near the top of it, gazing out at the incredible pastoral view. That's when they appeared. A group of people walking down towards me from the path above. They appeared to be fell walkers. They wore walking gear. They had knapsacks, but their knapsacks seemed to be empty. They carried no bottles of water. There were about 15 to 20 of them. Right away, I thought there was something off about them, but I couldn't put my finger on what. They paused very close to me and then gathered around me in a circle, chattering and laughing. They didn't acknowledge me at all at first, even though I was sitting right in the middle of their circle. It was incredibly bizarre. They were behaving in a way, as a friend who lives in France commented, that no French person would. It was uncomfortable. But still, they seemed human to me, just eccentric. I decided to break the ice and spoke to them the best I could in broken French. The first one I spoke to was a man who seemed to be their leader. He didn't say much to me, but appeared very dominant and had an almost regal bearing. Then I spoke briefly to a taciturn and sad-looking man. Not much was said. And finally I spoke to a woman. The woman stood over me. I was still sitting down. She had the strongest, most muscular legs I have ever seen, but in proportion. They were not grossly muscular. They looked like ordinary legs, but I doubt that they were. They were the legs of someone who has walked everywhere on every day of her life. This may seem preposterous, but I cannot stress enough the significance of her clearly not human legs. It was one of the things that truly made me realize I was with people who were not people. At that time, I was on a spiritual quest and had been on for about 20 years. I was holding a possession of mine that I always carry that has tremendous spiritual significance for me. I don't want to share what it is, as I feel that sharing it will diminish its personal significance. So this woman bent down and took this possession, said its name, kissed it, and then gave it back to me. At which point, as if their mission was over, the group turned and walked away. As they left me, they were chattering and laughing. I heard them doing so as they turned a bend and left my sight. After they had gone, I suddenly had this feeling of coming back to this reality, realizing that I had been in an altered state of consciousness and maybe outside of time. It was scarcely less than 10 seconds after the people had gone when I fully came back to myself, like I'd been splashed with cold water, and realized that something truly strange had occurred. I got up and followed them quickly. I turned the same bend, but there was no sight of them. They had vanished. I don't know what they were. It occurred to me that they might have been angels, but my first thought was fairies. I think fairies are creatures of a spiritual nature, possibly astral, who share our reality, but in a different way, who exist outside of time and space, who interact with us rarely, but always for a good reason. I wonder what they would say if you asked them to define humans. If you believe in the existence of fairies, however you might define them, it is possible that they might be able to cloud our perception of how they appear. If I were a fairy and traveling through the countryside of France, I wouldn't do so in gossamer wings while waving a magic wand around. but I might choose to camouflage myself as someone who would look at home in the hillsides, like a fell walker. I was in the woods following a raccoon trail up a creek. This was a trail I had never walked before, and I was very deep in the woods. Soon the trail divided into two. The trail on the right led to a dark and tangled, hostile woods. The trail to the left went up in a gentle slope towards a luminous, verdant, green, inviting woods. It was like something out of a movie. One trail looked like it led towards Mordor, the other towards the forest of the elves. I went left, up the hill towards the forest of the elves. Except that this trail didn't last long. Very soon I reached a leveling knoll where the trail ended. It just stopped. I found this strange. Trails usually don't end in the woods. Perplexed, I continued forward where the trail should have been into the woods, scrambling through the dense brush, limb to limb, trunk to trunk, for approximately 30 yards. Then I broke out of the brush and found myself in a meadow about the size of 2 basketball courts. It was not grassy, but full of knee-high wildflowers. Tall old fir trees with gnarly roots and mossed limbs skirted the circumference of the meadow, and a massive madrone tree stood in the middle. The atmosphere was alive and electric, and permeated by a deep, intense silence. But the silence wasn't disturbing to me. It felt healing. I felt the urge to stay there a while. The madrone tree had limbs growing out parallel to the ground, about chest high, but at one spot the branches drooped down to stomach level. I was able to climb up on those branches and then sat down in the saddle of the tree. As I sat there, I had the strange sense that despite the peacefulness of the place, the meadow was alive somehow, almost with suppressed laughter, and that some sort of joke was being played on me, though I couldn't figure out what or even why this thought had occurred to me at all. It was a strange thought. Evening was getting ready to descend, so I climbed down from the branch, intending to start for home. As I moved towards the edge of the meadow, I stepped carefully, trying to avoid treading on a single flower. The place was so beautiful, I felt like crushing the flowers would be like destroying a work of art. But a strange thing happened to me as I moved. A path seemed to open up for me, one step at a time, almost guiding my steps, as if the flowers were parting from me and offering me a path that wouldn't damage them. Then, at the edge of the meadow, just as I was entering the bush again, I heard a sound. A bell, like a tiny crystal silver type of bell. It rang just once. I can still hear it. It has stayed with me ever since and rings in my mind whenever I think of that meadow and that moment. I turned around and I saw something I know I wasn't supposed to see. I saw fairies. There's no other way to describe them. They were dancing and playing throughout the meadow. And I heard this music. I've been trying to describe the music ever since I heard it that day. I'm a pianist and always try to replicate what I heard, but it was like listening to multiple symphonies at once. As I stood there, dumbstruck, I had the sense that the fairies had been waiting for me to leave so that they could return to their revelries, and they simply hadn't been able to wait a second longer. I was supposed to have left. I wasn't supposed to turn around and see any of this. But I did. I saw them, and they knew I saw them. They knew that I knew that they knew. I felt all this in just a split moment outside the measure of time. And it was like the jig was up, and they decided to just tell me what was going on. I had stumbled on a celebration, clumsily in my human way. I had walked into the middle of it. It was a celebration to honor a great queen, the queen of the forest. When I had wandered into the meadow, the queen had taken the form of the madrone tree, and I had been sitting in her lap without knowing it. That was the joke. These fairies had watched me sit on the queen's lap and had laughed silently while waiting patiently for me to leave. Now I could see the queen as she actually was. She was beautiful, a woman with long hair. She told me I had to leave, but I didn't want to. I wanted to stay there with them forever. This was a very troubled time in my life, and seeing all this beauty and joy, I didn't want to let it go. I didn't want to return to all of the darkness and suffering my life had become. She told me, and I know it sounds cheesy, but this is what she said: love will overcome, and everything is joy. She said, yes, there's sadness, pain, death, loss, remorse, and all of that, but ultimately joy was what it was all about. This comforted me. I guess I needed to hear it. And I left. As I moved out of the woods, I felt like I was waking up from a trance, like I had experienced some kind of waking dream. Since that day, I've gone back many times to that meadow, but whatever I experienced has obviously moved on to other locations. The place doesn't feel at all the same as it did, and I have never experienced anything like that since. The experience remains with me, though. It was the most real and profound moment of my life. I've since studied the phenomenon of fairy encounters and have found many others have had similar experiences. Whatever it was, it touched me deeply. I wish for all the world to know an experience like this, however they might experience it. For me, it was like the darkness of fear instantly vanished, like a light switch had been flipped on. I'll never forget it. First of all, let me just say that prior to my experience, I didn't give fairy lore much credence, relegating it to children's bedtime stories. You know, fairy tales. In 2009, a very good friend and I traveled to Donegal in the northwest corner of Ireland, where we spent 4 days at a workshop. The affable Irish owner of the 400-year-old barn and cottage where my friend and I stayed picked us up from the small, quaint hamlet. The property was beautiful and wild looking, and as we approached it, I had this inexplicable feeling that some magic was afoot. When I told our new Irish friend how I felt, she chuckled softly and said there was a fairy well on the property, which sat on 6 acres, and people often reported experiences when staying there. We were taken straight away to our lodging, an almost derelict 400-year-old cottage on the edge of some woodland. Right outside, in the branches of the trees, were an assortment of various charms, pendulums, and chimes, which the owner said were there for protection. From what, I dared not ask. After depositing our luggage, we joined the owner for tea in the adjoining house, a charming barn conversion worthy of any droll Harry Potter movie. And it has to be said again, very fey and magical. We sat with her in her kitchen, and she shared stories with us about the magic well on the property and all the strange experiences other visitors have had there over the years. She also showed us countless photos of orbs and tiny lights that she and her daughters had taken in their walks in the nearby woods. I felt as though we were embarking on a wonderful adventure. Feeling travel weary, we went to bed early, leaving the fire in the hearth to warm us and a tea candle flickering as a nightlight. I awoke at around 3:30 with the distinct impression that someone or something was gently tugging at my head from the nape of my neck. I panicked and, in my sleepy state, mumbled over and over again, "No, no." Fright turned into annoyance, and now awake, I cried out angrily, "Just stop it!" I woke my friend up with the racket and explained what had happened. We both agreed that it was just a dream, and eventually drifted back to sleep. The rest of the trip was wonderful, and we had a great time. I never lost the sense that something magical was about to happen. On our last night in Donegal, we were having a chat with our lovely hostess in our cottage when I suddenly had this strong urge to play with my camera by the window. It was dark outside, and I pressed halfway down on my camera and looked through the viewfinder. I saw 3 large blue orbs right outside the window pane. It was as if they were looking in on us from outside. I ran outside, my 2 friends astonished and running after me, and started shooting photos. It was pitch dark, but I kept shooting my camera, stumbling around in excitement. As I ran around, I heard the sound of bells. They sounded distant and hollow, but they were unmistakably bells. Later, I found out that I had taken some fantastic orb photos. Once back home, I was examining the orb photos I had taken that last night, and when I zoomed in on one of them, I could see this unmistakable being in the photograph. It had a very angular face with huge eyes slanting upwards at the corners and slender arms with very long fingers. The figure looked androgynous, although I felt that it was male. One of its arms was outstretched in front of him, with his hand as if motioning for me to stop. I thought that I probably came too close to him when I was taking those pictures. I also had the strong impression that this being was quite regal, or maybe even high-born, if that's the appropriate word to describe it. He had a very angular face, elongated eyes, almost like a gray alien. In another photo of an orb, a blue one, I could make out a beatific little childlike face, which had a garland of flowers around its neck. Ever since then, I have had other fairy experiences. I think maybe a couple may have followed me home from Ireland. I've seen little blue lights or orbs around my flat from time to time, and sometimes I hear distant hollow bells ringing. I had not believed in fairies prior to my experience, but now no one can convince me that they don't exist. I started reading about them after my experience in Donegal. I wanted to make sense out of what I went through and what it meant. I don't know what fairies are. Sometimes I have wondered if they are connected with aliens somehow. I also wonder if they are not connected with the dead. They are for sure connected to nature. I believe they encompass not only nature with a capital N, but a different type of consciousness. I've continued to study them and to listen to experts on the subject. However, I've also sensed intuitively that it is better to keep my engagement with fairies to a minimum. This story starts with a dream. Over a period of, I think, a few months, I was having this recurring dream. The dream would start off in all sorts of weird ways, as dreams do, but it would always end in the same place, with me standing in front of a prison cell made of branches. In the dream, I knew that trapped in the cell was a fairy king, and that it was my job to release him. But I never managed to do it, at least not in the dream. But I think I might have done it in real life. I live right next to a forest, an old forest with ancient trees. I don't go walking in the forest very often because it gives off a forbidding, haunted feeling, like there's something alive in there and watching. I've seen floating lights in that forest at times and heard things, bits of music, voices on the wind emanating from those woods. I always got the feeling that the place was haunted and that it was best to stay away. During the pandemic, I've been working from home, and because I felt so cooped up, I've been going on frequent walks around my neighborhood. One afternoon last winter, after several months of having that dream, I went out on a walk and felt this uncontrollable urge to go into the forest, which I would normally never do. For whatever reason, on this afternoon, I was feeling particularly adventurous. The sun was out, and because it was winter, the trees were bare, which to me makes the forest seem less foreboding. I know some people will find that odd, but to me, when the forest is thick and green in the summer, it's at its most ominous and mysterious. Maybe because it's the most alive then, and there are the most places to hide. I took a narrow dog walking trail into the forest. It was peaceful. A gentle snow was falling, and I wasn't feeling unwelcome or watched or anything like that. I was enjoying the crisp, fresh air when I noticed to the left of the trail, about 10 feet into the brush, this large tangle of crisscrossed branches that formed a shape like a dome that went all the way to the ground. Instantly, I thought of a cage, and that made me think of the prison cell made of branches from my recurring dream. I stood there and stared at this thing for a while. It looked like a piece of natural artwork. It was like a bunch of branches and vines had grown together naturally to produce this shape. In the summer, it probably wouldn't have been visible at all, covered in leaves, but on this winter day in the sunlight, with the branches bare, it was the perfect time to see it. Then, out of the corner of my eye, just for a second, I thought I saw fingers peeking out from between those branches. I was pretty certain I had imagined the fingers, and probably because I was thinking about my dream. And yet I felt this strong urge to get closer to this cage-like mass. I moved through the brush towards the branches. I couldn't see anything or anyone inside it other than what you would expect, snow and brambles. But it was remarkable how much like a prison cell this thing looked the closer I got. I could just picture something, a person even, being trapped inside it. Some of the branches that served as quote-unquote bars had little red berries on them. I broke off some of these branches thinking the berries would look nice against the snow in my backyard. A part of me also felt I was breaking open the prison cell. I left a gaping hole in the side of it, big enough for a person to crawl through, and feeling like my work was done, headed home. I put the branches with the red berries on them in a snow-filled planter next to my back window. It did look nice there, decorative in a wintry way. The next day, I was making some tea, and when I passed by my back window, I glanced outside. And for a minute, I could swear there was a man standing outside my back fence. He was dressed in browns and whites, like a tree covered in snow, and he wore a crown that seemed to be made entirely of branches that stuck up straight in the air. almost like a headdress. He was very beautiful. I only saw him for a second. I blinked and he was gone. But I believe he was there. He was real. I didn't imagine him. I think he was the fairy king trapped in the cage that I had dreamed about. I think that mass of branches in the woods was the prison cell that was holding him. I think when I broke those branches, I released him, and his allowing me to see him, even for a second, was his way of thanking me. I know it sounds crazy, and I never talk about this because I know what people will say, but I think there are things in this world, things connected to nature that we don't understand fully, and we should keep an open mind about what's out there. Well, it could be that I just broke some branches and let my imagination carry me away. It could also be that I released a trapped fairy king from captivity. I like to think I did, and that it was a good thing to do. There's always the possibility, after all, that the king, if he did exist, was trapped there for a good reason. But he didn't feel like a wicked king to me. He felt kind. I haven't had any dreams about the trapped king since then, so maybe the story's over. But it's exciting for me to think that there could be this whole drama we don't know about playing out inside the forest. Who trapped that king anyway? And why? But I'll probably never know, and that's probably for the best. If fairies are real, they're a secretive bunch. And it's also said they can be quite dangerous if you encounter the wrong ones. Thanks for watching, and thanks to everyone who submitted their stories for this one. Let me know what you thought of these stories. What are your thoughts about fairy royalty? Do you have any theories about the fairy world, if it exists, and what it might be like? Let me know in the comments. I'll be there joining the discussion today, answering questions and reacting to comments and suggestions. If you have a story to share, you can check out my website at scaryfairygodmother.com. Link in the description. It has a spot where you can submit your stories, comments, questions, and suggestions as well. You can also sign up for my mailing list there. It's free to sign up, and I promise I will eventually send something on it. If you do submit your story or have submitted it in the past and I haven't narrated it yet, that doesn't mean I won't. It often takes me a while to get to these stories, so if you do submit it, eventually you probably will hear your own story narrated on this channel. I really try to get to all of them. Thank you so much for taking the time to share it with all of us. As always, special thanks to all my supporters on Patreon who are helping to keep this content going and hopefully expand in the future. I really appreciate you guys so much and the support you are giving this work. If you like this content and would like to support it, please check out my Patreon page. The link is in the description. The stories in this video came courtesy of subscribers and the Fairy Census at the Fairy Investigation Society, so thanks to everyone who submitted. The stories were edited for dramatic and narration reasons. If you would like to read the original Census stories, the link to the Census is in the description. If you've had a fairy experience and would like to share it, please email it to me or submit it on the website. Please leave a comment below, like, share, and subscribe if you're new. It really helps the channel when you do, and hit the bell to receive notifications. And until next time, this has been a visit from your scary fairy godmother.